Welcome to Crisis in Perception. We are so incredibly glad you are joining us. This is a series where we examine the unseen systems shaping our world.
Glad to be here.
To kick things off today, I want you to think about a central paradox, something that really sits right at the core of what it means to be a human being navigating this very strange reality of ours.
Right.
The human brain evolved these remarkable abilities for pattern recognition, for storytelling, and for belief.
Mhm.
And these are cognitive superpowers, really. They helped our ancestors survive the savannah.
They allow us to build communities, cooperate at scale.
Exactly, to maintain the social cohesion that you need to build a civilization. But here is the critical question we are exploring in this deep dive. What if those exact same cognitive abilities, the very ones that help us successfully navigate the physical world, what if they also make us incredibly systematically vulnerable to deception in the modern information age?
It's a profound paradox, and honestly, it is the entire basis of the system we are examining today. Because the system here is the complex, highly volatile interaction between human cognition and the modern information environment. It's an architecture where your psychological biases, media structures, and institutional incentives are just constantly interacting to shape what people believe.
And to really understand how this machinery operates, we are looking at some incredibly illuminating source material.
Yes, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, How to Know What's Really Real in a World Increasingly Full of Fake.
By Steven Novella, Bob Novella, Cara Santa Maria, and Jay Novella.
Right. And what this book serves as, fundamentally, is a comprehensive guide to scientific skepticism. It is a method for evaluating claims through evidence, logic, and, well, the scientific method itself.
And I think it is so important right up front to define what that actually means.
Yeah.
Because the word skepticism, it gets thrown around a lot.
Oh, constantly.
Often people hear it and they immediately think of cynicism. They picture someone who is just reflexively negative, someone who crosses their arms and dismisses everything just to be a contrarian.
Yeah, but that is not what the authors are talking about at all. Not even close.
No.
Rather than promoting cynicism, they argue that true scientific skepticism is a highly disciplined approach to understanding reality. It is an approach that fundamentally acknowledges the severe limits and the built-in biases of human cognition.
Because human cognition simply did not evolve to detect truth in a strict, objective, scientific sense.
No, it evolved to make fast decisions, to maintain social bonds, to construct narratives that feel meaningful.
Right.
And because of that evolutionary mandate, our brains rely heavily on mental shortcuts, heuristics. They help us interpret unbelievably complex environments in a fraction of a second.
Which is useful.
Undeniably useful for basic survival, but they also create highly predictable, systematic errors in how we perceive the world.
Which brings us to the core mission of this deep dive. We are going to deconstruct the architecture of belief formation. We want to look at how a belief actually forms in your mind, and more importantly, why it stays there even when the facts change.
Yeah, and the text introduces a brilliant concept for this called neuropsychological humility.
I love that phrase.
It sounds like a dense academic term, but it's actually deeply liberating. It simply means accepting that your brain, my brain, all of our brains, are incredibly flawed instruments for perceiving reality.
Memory is wildly unreliable.
Perception can be heavily distorted.
Our reasoning is permanently vulnerable to bias.
And accepting those limitations does not weaken our grasp on knowledge.
Yeah.
Quite the opposite. It strengthens the absolute necessity for methods designed to compensate for those human flaws.
Right. Scientific skepticism functions as a corrective system.
Because individual judgment is so inherently unreliable, we need tools. Things like peer review, statistical analysis, independent replication. We need methodological transparency to filter out the error from the evidence.
But as we will see, this corrective system faces massive, persistent challenges. Because this isn't happening in a vacuum.
No.
We live in a media ecosystem that heavily rewards speed and absolute certainty. It rewards those things far more than it rewards careful, nuanced evaluation.
We have political and ideological identities that reinforce motivated reasoning. We have economic incentives that actually encourage the selective interpretation of data.
So misinformation is not just a psychological glitch. It is structural.
Exactly. It emerges from the collision between our ancient cognitive limitations and the modern institutional incentives that actively amplify misleading claims.
Which leads us to the fundamental crisis in perception. The crisis arises the moment individuals assume that their own personal perceptions and their own gut intuitions are reliable guides to objective reality.
When your personal confidence replaces evidence-based evaluation, misinformation becomes practically impossible to detect.
Because belief formation is not purely individual.
Right. It is an emergent property of your cognitive architecture interacting with information systems.
Yeah.
So the challenge isn't simply that people hold false beliefs. The challenge is the underlying structure of belief formation itself.
So let's start dismantling that structure. Let's look at the biological hardware we're all running on. Most of us walk around with a very specific, very comforting assumption about how we experience the world.
We assume our eyes act like passive video cameras.
It's just streaming raw, unfiltered reality into our consciousness.
And we assume our memories act like computer hard drives, perfectly storing away those video files to be played back with complete accuracy later.
But the research presented in the source material completely obliterates that comforting myth. Perception is not passive. It is an intensely active, highly filtered, constructive process.
Your brain is essentially locked inside the dark vault of your skull. It's desperately trying to build a coherent model of the world for you in real time, relying on incomplete data.
And the brain absolutely despises ambiguity.
Oh, it hates it. The sensory information hitting your retinas and your eardrums is constantly fragmented. It's blurry or it's contradictory.
Right. If you experience the raw data your senses actually take in, it would just be this chaotic, incomprehensible mess.
So your brain acts as an aggressive editor. When stimuli are ambiguous, the brain frantically constructs an illusion to fill in the gaps. It relies heavily on your prior knowledge, your assumptions, your expectations.
The source text gives a fantastic visual example of this that anyone can look up online. The spinning girl illusion.
Oh, that's a classic.
It's a simple, animated silhouette of a dancer pirouetting on one leg, and the animation is specifically engineered to lack any depth cues.
There is no shading, no perspective lines.
Because it lacks those cues, the mathematical data hitting your eye makes equal logical sense whether the two-dimensional figure is spinning clockwise or counterclockwise.
But your brain refuses to see a two-dimensional shape shifting back and forth. It demands a three-dimensional reality.
Yeah.
So when you look at it, your brain makes an instantaneous, unconscious assumption. It assigns depth to the image and decides, she is spinning clockwise.
You see it clear as day.
But if you blink, or look away and look back, or focus on a different part of the image, your brain might suddenly flip its assumption. Suddenly, with absolute certainty, you see her spinning counterclockwise.
The wild part is that you can never, under any circumstances, see her spinning both ways at the exact same time. The image on the screen hasn't changed a single pixel.
The only thing that changed was the invisible assumption your brain made to resolve the ambiguity.
It constructed a singular, compelling reality and forced you to experience it. So if our brains are constantly doing this aggressively editing and constructing our visual reality, what happens when that editing process drops important information?
Well, that brings us to a phenomenon known as change blindness.
Right.
Because the brain is actively filtering the fire hose of sensory data just to keep you functioning, it actually throws away an astonishing amount of detail, especially when there is a brief visual disruption.
The text highlights a famous demonstration of this by a researcher named Richard Wiseman, the color-changing card trick.
That video is incredible.
If you haven't seen it, Wiseman is sitting at a table doing what looks like a standard close-up magic trick with a deck of cards. He's talking to the camera, explaining the trick, drawing all of your attention to the cards in his hands.
But while you are intensely focused on trying to figure out how he's manipulating the cards, the camera angle cuts briefly, and in the background, a staggering amount of reality is being altered.
Yeah.
The color of Wiseman's shirt changes, the color of the tablecloth changes, the entire backdrop behind him shifts to a completely different color.
And the vast majority of people who watch this video for the first time completely miss it.
They do not notice that the entire environment has transformed because their attention was narrowly spotlighted on the cards.
Their brain simply didn't bother to process the background details because it deemed them irrelevant to the task at hand. You watch it a second time and you feel almost foolish. Like, how could I possibly have missed the man's shirt changing from blue to red?
But it gets even more unsettling when researchers take this out of a controlled video environment and put it onto the streets.
Yeah, talk to me about the real-world experiments detailed in the text. Specifically, the door experiment by Dan Levin and Dan Simons, because this one genuinely shakes your faith in human perception.
It really does. So Levin and Simons wanted to see how far change blindness extends in normal social interactions. They had an experimenter walk up to a complete stranger on a college campus and ask for directions on a map.
Okay.
They are standing there face-to-face talking. Suddenly, two accomplices carrying a large, opaque door walk right between the experimenter and the stranger.
It creates a brief, maybe 2-second visual block.
Right. And during those 2 seconds, while the stranger's view is obstructed by the moving door, the original experimenter ducks down and scurries away. And a completely different person who was hiding behind the door stands up in their place.
So the door passes, and the stranger is now standing face to face with a totally different human being.
Yeah.
Different height, different voice, different clothes. What happens?
The shocking, almost unbelievable result is that roughly 50% of the subjects do not notice the change. Half of the people just continue pointing at the map and giving directions to the new person as if nothing happened.
How is that neurologically possible? If I am looking someone in the eyes, how does my brain not register that their face has literally been replaced?
It comes back to those heuristics, those mental shortcuts. Processing every single microscopic detail of a stranger's face requires a massive amount of cognitive energy.
And our brains want to conserve energy.
Exactly. So instead of memorizing the exact geometry of the person's nose or the exact shade of their hair, the brain categorizes them broadly. It applies a label. The brain says, I am currently interacting with a young, brown-haired male student.
Ah, okay.
When the door passes, the brain quickly checks the new person against that broad category. If the replacement person also roughly fits the category of young, brown-haired male student, the brain just rolls with it. It assumes continuity.
The specific details didn't register because the broad categorical label remained consistent.
Yeah.
If we extrapolate that out to the real world, the implications are absolutely terrifying, particularly when you think about the justice system.
Oh, absolutely.
We place so much weight on eyewitness testimony. We put people in prison, sometimes on death row, based on someone pointing a finger on a witness stand and saying, that is the man I saw running from the alley.
But if half of us can't even notice when the person we are actively speaking to transforms into someone else in broad daylight, how can we possibly trust a fleeting memory of a stressful event?
We can't. The scientific consensus is that we cannot trust it blindly. Eyewitness testimony is notoriously, demonstrably unreliable.
And this vulnerability isn't just limited to everyday low-stakes encounters. It applies to massive, highly traumatic, high-stakes events as well.
Yeah, the text brings up a very sobering historical example that perfectly illustrates how the brain constructs false realities under pressure. The tragedy of TWA Flight 800.
Let's set the scene for that, because it's a profound case study in perception. It was July 1996, a warm summer evening. TWA Flight 800, a massive Boeing 747, takes off from JFK Airport in New York, heading for Paris.
It climbs up over Long Island Sound.
Down below, on the beaches and boats, hundreds of people are looking up at the sky, and suddenly, catastrophically, the plane explodes in midair and falls into the ocean.
All 230 people on board were killed. It was a massive national trauma.
And immediately afterward, the FBI and the National Transportation Safety Board launched one of the most extensive investigations in history. They interviewed hundreds of eyewitnesses.
And a shocking number of those witnesses swore with absolute certainty that they saw a missile fly up from the surface of the Earth, streak through the sky, and hit the plane.
They weren't just guessing. They were providing detailed accounts of a light ascending from the horizon, trailing smoke, intersecting with the aircraft, and causing the fireball.
Which fueled intense public speculation. Massive conspiracy theories that the plane had been shot down by terrorists or by a rogue U.S. Navy missile strike.
But the physical evidence, the actual grinding reality of the science, told a completely different story.
The investigators spent months painstakingly dredging the ocean floor. They pulled up millions of pieces of shredded aluminum and wire.
They literally rebuilt the fuselage of the shattered 747 inside a massive hangar to examine every rivet and scorch mark. And what did they find?
They proved definitively, beyond any shadow of a scientific doubt, that there was no missile.
Zero explosive residue characteristic of a warhead. No penetration marks from shrapnel.
The cause was a tragic, invisible mechanical failure. A short circuit had ignited volatile fuel vapors in the center wing fuel tank. The plane blew up from the inside out.
So if there was no missile, what on earth did hundreds of sane, rational people see? Were they all lying? Were they hallucinating?
They were not lying, and they were not hallucinating in a clinical sense.
They were experiencing the systemic outcome of how a human brain processes sudden, chaotic trauma.
Think about what actually happened in the sky. When the center fuel tank exploded, the nose of the massive aircraft actually sheared off. But the engines were still running at full thrust.
Right. So for a brief, terrifying few seconds, the burning fuselage of the plane actually pitched sharply upward. It climbed higher into the sky, trailing a massive streak of burning jet fuel before finally losing momentum and falling into the ocean.
And the people on the ground were subjected to an incredibly ambiguous, overwhelming stimulus. You are standing on a beach and suddenly the sky is on fire.
Yeah.
You don't know what you're looking at.
Exactly. The brain is overwhelmed by the sudden chaos and immediately tries to impose order on it. It searches its database for a narrative that makes sense of a streak of fire moving upward in the sky.
And for an American in the late 20th century, raised on action movies and news footage of wars, the most readily available narrative for a fiery streak in the sky is a missile.
The brain frantically stitched together the streak of burning fuel, the upward trajectory of the headless plane, and the final explosion, and it constructed a memory of a missile strike.
And here is the truly humbling, almost frightening part of the neuropsychology. The moment your brain constructs that narrative to resolve the ambiguity, it instantly encodes it as a memory.
And memories are not video files.
No.
They are just as malleable, just as constructive as perception itself. Every single time you recall an event, you are not pressing play. You are pulling the pieces of the memory out of storage and actively rebuilding it.
And every time you rebuild it, it can be slightly altered by new information, leading questions, or just the passage of time.
Those witnesses who testified to seeing a missile weren't lying. They were truthfully reporting a false reality that their own brains had constructed to make sense of tragedy.
It is a devastating blow to our cognitive ego. Our perception is flawed at the moment of capture, and our memory is flawed at the moment of retrieval. We're navigating the world through a deeply distorted lens.
And this vulnerability is something we carry with us right from childhood. The author of the text shares a very relatable personal anecdote about this. He talks about growing up in the 1970s and watching a popular television show called In Search of.
Oh, I know the exact show. It was hosted by Leonard Nimoy, who was famous globally for playing the ultra-logical Mr. Spock on Star Trek.
Right, and the show would present these incredibly compelling documentary-style investigations into the paranormal. Nimoy, projecting all that calm, Spock-like authority, would guide the audience through evidence for the Loch Ness Monster, the lost city of Atlantis, ancient aliens building the pyramids.
The show used ominous music, dramatic reenactments, interviews with supposed experts.
And if you are a 10-year-old kid watching that, you don't have the critical faculties to understand the difference between a peer-reviewed scientific consensus and a sensationalized entertainment program.
You just see a trusted authority figure telling you that Bigfoot is probably real.
What is deeply insightful is how the author describes the way a child's mind handles all this disparate information. He talks about compartmentalizing his beliefs. He was happily absorbing these fantastic narratives about Atlantis and sea monsters on television, while simultaneously being raised in a Catholic household learning about Adam and Eve, and going to school learning about Charles Darwin and the fossil record.
He had the Loch Ness Monster, biblical creation, and evolutionary biology all coexisting perfectly fine in completely separate, isolated compartments of his young mind.
Which is such a universal human experience. We all start out as children who implicitly trust authority figures, whether they are our parents, our teachers, or the guy on the television.
We absorb claims without filtering them because we lack the data to do so. But as we grow up, if we are paying attention, we start to realize that the adults in our lives are often telling us things that are mutually exclusive.
A literal interpretation of Genesis, the mechanics of natural selection, and the existence of a prehistoric plesiosaur hiding in a Scottish lake cannot all be objectively true at the same time. The world doesn't work that way. Maturation, in an intellectual sense, requires us to drag those comfortable beliefs out of their isolated compartments. We have to lay them out on the table under the harsh light of evidence and begin the painful process of sorting them out.
It requires us to know what is real.
That journey of sorting out conflicting narratives brings us to a fascinating quirk of our biology.
Let me pose a question to you, the listener. Have you ever been alone in a house at night, maybe reading a book or trying to sleep, and you hear a sudden thump from the floor above you? What happens in your body?
Your heart rate spikes.
Your adrenaline surges, and your immediate instinctive thought is, there is an intruder in the house. Your brain immediately jumps to the conclusion of a burglar, rather than the vastly more statistically probable conclusion that it's just the house settling, or the wind rattling a loose window pane, or a squirrel on the roof.
Why does our brain default to the most terrifying, intentional explanation?
The answer lies in a deeply ingrained evolutionary mechanism. Psychologist Justin Barrett coined a term for this, the hyperactive agency detection device, or HADD for short.
This is a fundamental, hardwired piece of our cognitive architecture. Our brains are obsessively scanning our environment, trying to distinguish between things that are just inanimate objects and things that possess agency.
An agent is something that has intent, will, and the ability to act upon the world. To put it in evolutionary terms, it is the difference between a rock and a bear.
If you are an early hominid walking through the brush and you see a dark shape in your peripheral vision, you have to make a split-second calculation. If you mistake a rock for a bear, your heart races, you run away, you feel a little silly, but you survive to pass on your genes.
The cost of a false positive is negligible.
But if you make the opposite error, if you mistake a bear for a rock, you ignore it, you walk past it, and you get eaten. You are removed from the gene pool.
The cost of a false negative is lethal.
Because of that brutal evolutionary arithmetic, natural selection cranked our agency detection dial all the way up to hyperactive. We are vastly biased toward detecting hidden agents, hidden intents, and hidden minds in our environment, even when there are none.
And this wiring runs so incredibly deep. You can see it in children before they can even speak. Infants react differently to objects that appear to move under their own volition. We naturally imbue agents with a unique essence, a life force.
A block of wood is just a generic object, but an agent is something special.
This is exactly why a child can take a piece of cloth stuffed with cotton, put some googly eyes on it, and treat it as a living friend with feelings and a personality.
It's also why we, as sophisticated adults, can sit in a movie theater, look at a massive screen projecting completely two-dimensional animated pixels, and genuinely weep when a cartoon character experiences tragedy.
We know, on a logical level, that they are just drawings. But our hyperactive agency detection device bypasses that logic. It recognizes the behavioral cues of intent and emotion and automatically processes those pixels as a living, breathing agent deserving of empathy.
Okay, so we have this biological system constantly hyperactively scanning for hidden intent in the shadows. How does that leap from making us scared of a bump in the night to forming the foundation of massive, complex, global conspiracy theories?
It scales up dramatically when we encounter massive, chaotic, or highly complex events that disrupt our sense of safety and order.
Think about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, or the horrific terrorist attacks of 9/11, or even monumental human achievements like the Apollo moon landings.
When a society experiences an event of that magnitude, our brains struggle to accept a mundane or chaotic explanation.
Right. The idea that a single, deeply troubled man with a mail-order rifle could alter the trajectory of global history by shooting the most powerful man in the world from a book depository window, well, it feels disproportionate.
It feels deeply unsatisfying to a brain that demands meaning and narrative. The idea that chaotic things just happen is neurologically repulsive to us.
Exactly. We inherently reject random chaos. So what does the brain do? The hyperactive agency detection device kicks into overdrive. It insists that a massive event must have a massive, coordinated, highly intentional cause.
Instead of accepting the terrifying reality of random chaos, we invent a hidden agent pulling the strings. We invent the cabal, the shadow government, the grand, perfectly executed plot.
And once that grand narrative of the hidden agent is formed, the brain goes to work defending it. This is where anomaly hunting comes in.
People start scrubbing through the data, looking for anything that feels off to support the conspiracy.
You see this constantly with 9/11 truthers. They will look at the photos of the Pentagon debris field and say, where is the plane? Why doesn't the hole in the building look exactly the way I assume a plane crash should look? Therefore, it must have been a missile.
Or they look at the iconic photographs taken by the Apollo astronauts on the surface of the moon, and they point out that the sky is completely black, but there are no stars visible. They say, look at this anomaly. This proves they were on a Hollywood soundstage.
But in both of those examples, they are making incredibly naive assumptions based on zero actual expertise.
Let's think about the Pentagon. How often in your daily life do you observe a commercial airliner weighing hundreds of thousands of pounds slamming into a reinforced concrete and masonry structure at 500 miles an hour?
Never.
It's a completely unique physics event. Why would you, as a layperson, possess an accurate, intuitive understanding of what that debris field is supposed to look like?
You wouldn't. Your intuition is useless in that scenario. The plane shatters, the aluminum fragments, the heavy engines penetrate deep into the structure, but the anomaly hunter uses their naive intuition as definitive proof of a cover-up.
And the same applies to the moon photos. The lack of stars isn't a mistake by a Hollywood set designer. It's basic photography.
The lunar surface in direct sunlight is incredibly bright. To capture the white spacesuits without overexposing the film, the astronauts had to use very fast shutter speeds.
A fast shutter speed doesn't let enough light in to capture the faint pinpoint light of distant stars. It's basic physics.
But to a brain primed by HADD, seeking a hidden agent, that simple photographic reality looks like a sinister clue.
This overwhelming biological urge to project agency where none exists isn't just a quirky phenomenon that leads to internet arguments about the moon landing. It can have devastating, tragic consequences in the real world.
We really need to shift gears and discuss a profoundly heartbreaking story detailed in the source material, the case of Hubin.
This is perhaps one of the most sobering examples of neuropsychological humility in modern medical history.
Hubin was a young man in Belgium who was involved in a horrific car crash in 1983. He suffered severe brain trauma and was diagnosed as being in a persistent vegetative state.
For 23 years, his body was kept alive, but doctors believe his consciousness was completely gone. Decades pass.
Then, in 2009, this story explodes into the international media. An accomplished, highly respected neurologist named Dr. Steven Novella examined Hubin and made a miraculous claim.
He announced to the world that Hubin had been misdiagnosed. He claimed that Hubin wasn't vegetative at all, but was actually locked in, meaning his mind was fully awake, fully conscious, trapped inside a paralyzed body for 23 years, unable to scream or signal that he was there.
The horror of that idea is unimaginable. But Dr. Loris didn't just claim Hubin was awake, he claimed they had found a way to communicate with him. They used a controversial technique known as facilitated communication, or FC.
Let's paint the picture of what this actually looked like, because the video footage of this was broadcast globally. You see Hubin sitting in a specialized wheelchair, and standing next to him is a facilitator.
The facilitator is holding Hubin's hand, ostensibly supporting his finger as he points to letters on a touchscreen keyboard.
And through this process, Hubin is supposedly typing out these incredibly eloquent, emotionally complex messages about his lost years and his thoughts on life. It was hailed as a medical miracle.
But the scientific and skeptical community immediately raised massive red flags when they watched those videos. If you looked closely, divorced from the emotional narrative of the miracle, the mechanics of the communication were physically impossible.
The facilitator's hand was flying rapidly, smoothly, and with total precision across the keyboard, typing out complete sentences.
But Hubin's eyes were often closed, or his head was slumped, looking completely away from the screen. He wasn't even looking at the letters his finger was supposedly choosing.
If you aren't looking at the keyboard, how can you possibly guide someone else's hand to strike the correct keys to spell out complex words at high speed? You can't.
So what was actually happening here? Was the facilitator just an evil fraud, maliciously manipulating this paralyzed man for fame?
No, and that is the truly insidious part of this phenomenon. The facilitator was almost certainly not faking it maliciously. They were falling victim to something called the ideomotor effect.
This is a deeply established psychological phenomenon where a person's expectations and beliefs trigger subtle, unconscious, involuntary muscle movements.
It is the exact same mechanism that makes a Ouija board planchette move. The people holding the planchette honestly feel like an external spirit is pulling their hands.
But in reality, their own subconscious expectations are generating tiny muscle twitches that push the piece of wood to spell the words they expect to see.
So the facilitator, desperately wanting to believe that this man was communicating, was unconsciously generating all the movement, doing all the typing, and attributing their own thoughts to Hubin.
Their brain's hyperactive agency detection device projected a conscious mind into the paralyzed man, and their own ideomotor movements fulfilled the illusion.
And here is the ultimate lesson in humility. Dr. Steven Novella, an expert neurologist, a man whose entire career is dedicated to understanding the brain, was completely fooled by this.
He watched a facilitator author messages using a deeply flawed pseudoscientific method, and his own brain accepted the illusion of the miracle over the cold, hard reality of the physics.
It proves that no amount of education makes you immune to the flaws of human cognition.
To Dr. Lori's immense credit, when the pressure mounted from the scientific community, he agreed to perform a rigorous, blinded experiment.
They set up a test where the facilitator was prevented from seeing the objects or words that were being shown to Hubin.
And the moment the blinding was applied, the communication instantly completely failed. Without the facilitator's eyes to see the answers, Hubin's hand typed nothing but gibberish.
The tragic reality was definitively proven. The facilitator had been the sole author of the messages all along.
The false hope that had been given to the family, the global media circus, all of it was built on an illusion generated by a cognitive glitch.
It highlights with devastating clarity why we desperately, urgently need the rigorous, dispassionate structure of scientific testing. Our intuitions and our hopes will routinely betray us.
The Rumhuben tragedy perfectly illustrates the failure of our sensory hardware. But let's move forward and talk about what happens when our cognitive software, our actual logic and reasoning, tries to process the world.
If our perception is constantly misfiring, how does our conscious reasoning try to compensate? This brings us to the realm of metacognition, the act of thinking about our own thinking.
It is vital to recognize that we are not Vulcans. We do not navigate the world by running pure mathematical algorithms in our heads before every decision. We simply don't have the processing power or the time.
Instead, our cognitive software relies heavily on those heuristics we mentioned earlier. Think of a heuristic as a 90% rule. It is a mental shortcut that works well enough, most of the time, to get you through the day.
For instance, if my phone rings and the caller ID shows an unknown number from a different country, and the person on the line immediately tells me I owe the IRS money and must pay in gift cards, my heuristic instantly screams, "This is a scam."
I don't need to hire a private investigator to verify it. 99% of the time, that heuristic is correct and it saves me money.
Exactly. The heuristic is highly efficient. The software glitches occur, however, when these mental shortcuts are misapplied to complex situations where they simply don't belong.
When we use a simple rule to solve a complex problem, we generate massive inaccuracies. The text highlights a fascinating, very relatable example of a broken heuristic known as unit bias.
This one blew my mind a little bit because it's so obviously flawed once you think about it. The authors detail a 2009 psychological study conducted by researchers Geyer and Rozan.
They wanted to see how accurately people could estimate the physical weight of other individuals just by looking at them.
It seems like a simple task, but the researchers discovered a massive systemic flaw in how people judged weight. The subjects in the study consistently relied almost exclusively on a single variable, the person's girth or width.
They took one salient, obvious feature and used it as the sole metric for their estimation. In doing so, they completely ignored the other critical variable, the person's height.
So if they saw someone who was 6'5" and relatively slim, and someone who was 5'2" and carried a bit more weight, they would vastly overestimate the weight of the shorter person and underestimate the taller person.
Simply because their heuristic told them wider equals heavier, they tried to simplify a complex physical reality volume and mass into a single, easy-to-process variable, and the software completely crashed.
We do this constantly across all areas of life. We take complex, multivariate geopolitical conflicts or economic issues and try to boil them down to a single, easily digestible narrative of good guys versus bad guys.
It is a software limitation. But the undisputed king of all cognitive software glitches, the bias that drives more societal conflict, tribalism, and misinformation than any other, is confirmation bias.
Let's really dig into this because confirmation bias is the invisible engine driving so much of the modern crisis in perception. Every single one of us has a worldview.
We have a paradigm, a set of beliefs and assumptions that we use to organize the chaotic information of reality into a coherent story.
Confirmation bias is the powerful, unconscious tendency of our brains to notice, accept, and remember information that supports our existing worldview, while actively ignoring, distorting, or rapidly forgetting any information that contradicts it.
And the most dangerous aspect of confirmation bias is that it operates silently in the background. It doesn't feel like you are being biased.
It simply feels like you are observing reality, and shockingly, reality seems to perfectly align with what you already believe. You only notice the green cars when you are thinking about buying a green car.
You only remember the times the psychic made a lucky guess, and you completely forget the 99 times they were wrong.
But reality is stubborn. Eventually, the world is going to present you with hard, undeniable evidence that directly contradicts a deeply held belief.
When confirmation bias isn't strong enough to filter out that contradictory data, our brains deploy a more active defense mechanism known as motivated reasoning.
When we are faced with facts that challenge our identity or our tribe, it generates a deeply uncomfortable psychological state called cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance is the mental pain of holding two conflicting ideas. and human beings will do almost anything to escape that pain.
Motivated reasoning is the process of working backward from your desired conclusion, desperately searching for any rationalization to dismiss the threatening data.
It is emotionally infinitely easier to invent a sprawling conspiracy theory or to viciously attack the character of the scientist presenting the data than it is to sit in the discomfort of cognitive dissonance and admit, I was wrong about this.
Now, I want to be extremely clear and very deliberate about how we handle the next point, because the source material dives into some highly charged territory here.
Yes, the authors point out that motivated reasoning isn't just an individual quirk anymore. It has been weaponized and industrialized.
There are organized, heavily funded movements out there that exist solely to provide pre-packaged rationalizations for their followers.
The text specifically lists several arenas where this happens. Debates around the gender pay gap, the effectiveness and safety of vaccines, the safety of genetically modified organisms, the reality of global warming, and the teaching of evolutionary biology.
It is crucial for you, the listener, to understand our goal here. We are not using this deep dive to litigate the political or ideological truth of those specific, highly complex topics.
We are impartially reporting the observations of the authors regarding the mechanics of belief. We are not endorsing any side here. The true crisis in perception highlighted by the source material is the structural reality of the internet age.
The crisis is the systemic, immediate availability of ready-made excuses.
Exactly. If you hold a strong belief about any of those topics, and a colleague or a family member presents you with a peer-reviewed study that contradicts your position, you don't even have to do the mental gymnastics of motivated reasoning yourself anymore.
You don't have to sweat it out. You can simply go online, visit a forum or a website aligned with your tribe, and instantly download an itemized, bullet point list of talking points specifically engineered to dismiss that exact piece of evidence.
It is a defensive shield, custom-built to protect you from the pain of changing your mind.
It creates a closed epistemic loop. The software glitch of motivated reasoning is now being subsidized by the information environment.
And speaking of the information environment, there's another massive trap we fall into when we try to process data. Finding false patterns. This is commonly known as data mining.
This is a mathematical certainty that completely breaks our intuition. Human beings are pattern-seeking animals. But if you give a pattern-seeking animal a massive, unstructured pile of random data, the mathematics of probability guarantee that they will find correlations that look incredibly meaningful, but are entirely driven by chance.
The text illustrates this beautifully with a story about astrology and car crashes. There was a highly publicized study released by an Australian insurance company called Suncorp Metway.
They analyzed their database of car accidents and proudly announced a stunning correlation. They claimed that people with certain astrological signs were significantly more likely to get into car crashes.
Which, if you are a believer in astrology, feels like ultimate vindication. Look, the data proves that Geminis are terrible drivers.
But the hallmark of scientific skepticism is understanding that finding a pattern once is meaningless. A random cluster of data can look like a pattern.
The true, rigorous test of any pattern is independent replication. Can you take that exact same hypothesis, apply it to a completely new, independent set of data, and find the exact same result?
Precisely. And that is exactly what happened in 2006. The president of a completely different company, InsuranceHotline.com, decided to test this astrological claim.
They looked at a massive, independent data set of 100,000 driving records and insurance claims. If the stars actually dictated driving ability, the pattern should hold. What did they find?
A completely different result. In this new data set, completely different astrological signs, Libra, Aquarius, and Aries, were flagged as the worst drivers. The results completely contradicted the original Suncorp Metway study.
Which proves that the initial correlation was nothing more than statistical noise. It was a phantom pattern generated by data mining.
If you chop up a large enough group of people by birth month, by sheer random chance, one of those months will have a slightly higher number of accidents in a given sample. It means absolutely nothing about celestial bodies influencing human reflexes.
So, why does this matter for you listening right now? It matters because our intuitive common sense constantly compels us to accept the patterns we see in our daily lives as profound truths.
Without the systematic, rigorous, and often incredibly tedious methods of logic and science to test those patterns, to demand independent replication, we might actually end up believing that the alignment of Jupiter is the reason we rear-ended a minivan at a stoplight.
We are desperate for the world to make sense, and we will grab onto any pattern that offers an explanation, no matter how absurd.
Which serves as the perfect bridge into examining the broader architecture of our world. We've spent significant time dissecting how our individual brains fail, the hardware flaws of perception, and the software glitches of bias.
But the true crisis in perception emerges when those individual psychological failures are amplified and exploited by massive institutional structures.
Let's look at the systemic incentives driving media, academia, and the wellness industries. To do that, we first have to tackle the demarcation problem.
The demarcation problem is the philosophical challenge of drawing a clear, definitive line between genuine science and pseudoscience. How do we tell the difference between a rigorous pursuit of knowledge and a sophisticated masquerade?
According to the authors, the core difference doesn't lie in the complexity of the jargon used, but in the fundamental methodology and the underlying intent.
Genuine science operates strictly under a philosophy called methodological naturalism. That sounds intimidating, but it simply means that science plays by a specific set of rules. It assumes that all observable effects in the universe have natural, physical causes that can be quantified, tested, and studied.
Science does not deal in the supernatural because the supernatural, by definition, cannot be reliably measured or tested. Furthermore, a hallmark of genuine science is that it actively tries to disprove its own hypotheses.
A rigorous scientist builds a theory and then spends their career trying to break it. If it survives the breaking, it gets provisionally closer to the truth.
Pseudoscience operates in the exact opposite direction. It works backward. Practitioners of pseudoscience start with an unshakable, deeply desired conclusion, and they only look for data that verifies it, ignoring or excusing any data that contradicts it.
They don't try to break their theories, they build protective walls around them.
A pervasive example of pseudoscience highlighted in the text is the enduring belief in dualism and vitalism. This is the ancient, deeply romantic idea that living things are animated by some mystical, non-physical life force or energy.
You see this underlying philosophy in countless alternative therapies. The concept of qi in traditional medicine, the idea of innate intelligence in early chiropractic philosophy, or the manipulation of a human energy field in practices like Reiki or therapeutic touch.
It's an incredibly appealing idea. It makes us feel special, connected to a cosmic energy. The problem, as the authors note, is that despite decades of claims, no one has ever been able to demonstrate that this vitalistic energy actually exists.
It cannot be detected, measured, or quantified by any known scientific instrument. So, to maintain the illusion of scientific validity, proponents often point to things like Kirlian photography as their definitive, irrefutable proof.
If you aren't familiar with Kirlian photography, it's a technique that produces images showing a glowing, colorful electrical aura radiating around the edges of an object, often a leaf or a person's hand.
For decades, proponents of vitalism have held up these photographs and declared, "Look, we captured the invisible human energy field on film. The life force is real."
But when actual physicists and material scientists examine the phenomenon, the magic evaporates entirely. Kirlian photography is a well-understood, entirely natural physical phenomenon.
Exactly. The glowing aura is not a mystical life force. It is simply a coronal discharge. It is the visual manifestation of moisture, barometric pressure, and high-voltage electrical fields interacting with the photographic plate.
If you change the humidity in the room, the aura changes. If you take a photograph of a damp penny, the penny will have a beautiful, glowing aura. The penny does not have a soul or a chi, it is just physics.
The authors identify this desperate clinging to mystical explanations as the mind of gaps fallacy. It's an offshoot of the God of the gaps argument. It relies on the fact that cognitive science and neuroscience have not yet completely mapped every single microscopic mechanism of how the physical brain generates subjective consciousness.
It is a work in progress. But dualists look at that current gap in scientific knowledge and say, aha, science can't explain consciousness yet, therefore it must be magic, it must be vital energy.
But that is a profound failure of logic. Simply not knowing exactly how phenomenon A causes phenomena B does not give you license to insert the supernatural as the default explanation. It just means the puzzle is incomplete. It means we have more rigorous science left to do.
However, the text is also ruthlessly honest about the failings of the scientific establishment itself. Mainstream genuine science is not a pristine, perfect endeavor immune to systemic rot.
Scientists are human beings. They have mortgages, they need tenure, and they face crushing, unrelenting pressure from academic institutions to constantly publish novel, exciting, statistically significant results.
This structural pressure leads to a massive, pervasive problem known as p-hacking.
This is critical to understand because it explains why the public is constantly bombarded with contradictory health headlines. P-hacking is the subtle, often unconscious manipulation of statistical data to artificially produce a statistically significant result that can be published in a journal.
It is rarely mustache-twirling fraud. It usually happens when well-meaning researchers let their biases guide their data analysis.
Let's construct a hypothetical scenario to make this concrete, because the mechanics of p-hacking are fascinating. Imagine you are a researcher who just secured a massive grant to study the health effects of eating jelly beans.
You spend 2 years tracking thousands of people, monitoring their diets, and checking them for 50 different medical conditions. You run your analysis, and the data shows absolutely nothing. Jelly beans have no statistically significant impact on health.
If the system functioned perfectly, you would publish a paper saying jelly beans do nothing, and that would be valuable data. But negative results rarely get published in prestigious journals.
They don't generate headlines. They don't secure the next round of grant funding. Your career is stalling.
So, feeling the pressure, you go back to your massive data set. You start slicing and dicing the data, looking for anything. You say, what if I only look at men over 40? What if I only look at people who ate specifically green jelly beans? What if I check the green jelly bean eaters against the incidence of acne?
And here is where the mathematics of data mining betray us again. Because you are testing so many variables against so many conditions, the laws of probability guarantee that eventually, purely by random chance, you will find a correlation that crosses the arbitrary threshold of statistical significance.
You find that in your specific sample, men over 40 who ate green jelly beans had a 5% lower incidence of acne.
It's statistical noise. It means nothing. But because it crosses the mathematical threshold, you ignore the hundreds of failed correlations, write a paper focusing exclusively on the green jelly beans, and publish it.
The university press office puts out a glossy press release. The media, desperate for daily content, runs the headline, "Scientific Breakthrough. Green jelly beans cure acne."
And the systemic damage is done. The public reads that headline. A week later, another team tries to replicate the study and fails, and the media runs a new headline, "Green jelly beans cause cancer."
The public is whipped back and forth by an endless parade of spurious, contradictory breakthroughs. Eventually, exhaustion sets in. People throw their hands up and say, well, the scientists clearly have no idea what they're talking about, so I'm just going to trust my gut.
The structural incentives of academia and media directly damage the credibility of the entire scientific process, which is actually supposed to be a slow, methodical, incremental march toward truth.
And if the structural incentives of science are problematic, the incentives of the broader media ecosystem are practically toxic. This environment actively weaponizes our cognitive biases through tactics like astroturfing.
If you aren't familiar with the term, astroturfing is the deliberate creation of fake, synthetic grassroots activism.
It is a brilliant, insidious strategy. Massive corporations, political action committees, or special interest groups know that if they put out a press release under their own corporate logo, the public will be highly skeptical.
So instead, they funnel money into creating seemingly independent nonprofits, Facebook groups, and thousands of artificial social media personas.
They manufacture the visceral illusion that there is a massive, organic groundswell of public support or public outrage regarding a specific issue. The entire architecture of the campaign is designed to conceal who is truly funding the message.
The source material highlights a deeply ironic, multi-layered example of how pervasive and confusing this information warfare can get. They discuss a TEDx talk given by a woman named Cheryl Atkinson.
Atkinson was a prominent award-winning journalist for CBS News. She stood on the TEDx stage and delivered an impassioned, articulate speech warning the public about the dangers of astroturfing.
As her primary example of corporate manipulation, she claimed that pharmaceutical companies were aggressively using astroturfing campaigns to bury the supposed link between vaccines and autism.
It sounded like a courageous journalist speaking truth to power, but the authors point out the breathtaking irony of her presentation. Cheryl Atkinson herself had a long, well-documented history of promoting anti-vaccine views, often relying on deeply flawed or retracted studies.
She had positioned herself as an objective journalist, but she was fundamentally compromised by her own motivated reasoning regarding vaccines.
So let's untangle the layers of this. You have a journalist who is deeply sympathetic to an anti-vaccine narrative, a narrative that itself was heavily promoted by pseudoscientific astroturfing campaigns.
She then uses a prestigious platform to give a speech warning people about astroturfing, using that very speech as a shield to further promote her preferred anti-vaccine narrative under the guise of exposing corporate malfeasance.
The authors compare it to the movie Inception. Once the information environment becomes this heavily tainted by bias, denialism, and sophisticated astroturfing, the public has no idea how many layers deep into the dream they are.
You cannot trust the surface reality of the information presented to you. You are wandering through a hall of mirrors.
And this confusion is compounded exponentially by a deep structural flaw in modern journalism known as false balance. Journalism, for decades, has worshipped at the altar of objectivity, which often translates into simply giving equal platform and equal time to both sides of an issue.
Which works perfectly fine if you are debating tax policy or zoning laws, but it is catastrophic when applied to empirical science.
False balance occurs when a media outlet gives equal time to a massive, overwhelming consensus of thousands of experts and a single, isolated contrarian or crank, presenting them as two equally valid sides of a legitimate scientific debate.
The text puts this in brilliant perspective. They clarify what a fact actually means in science. A scientific fact is not absolute, unquestionable dogma.
A fact is simply a hypothesis that has been confirmed by so much independent evidence and with too many attempts to falsify it that it would be intellectually perverse to withhold your provisional assent.
Exactly. We know that gravity exists. To use their analogy, if a news program is doing a segment on physics, they do not need to split the screen and give equal time to a physicist explaining gravity and a random person claiming that apples might decide to fall upward into the sky tomorrow.
Doing so creates a massive illusion for the viewer. The viewer assumes that if the news is hosting a debate, there must be a genuine 50-50 controversy in the scientific community. False balance manufactures doubt where none exists, simply to generate conflict and retain viewer attention.
Okay. We have waded through the deep waters of this crisis. We have looked at the flawed hardware of our brains making us see ghosts. We've examined the glitches in our cognitive software that lock us into motivated reasoning.
And we've stared at the incredibly confusing, incentive-driven institutional structures of media and academia. If this is the architecture of reality, how do we survive it? How do we navigate the structure without losing our minds?
This brings us to the final part of our journey, the Skeptics Toolkit. And the first tool we need is a clear, functional definition of scientific skepticism.
As we touched on earlier, it is absolutely vital to distinguish scientific skepticism from philosophical skepticism.
If you look back at René Descartes, he famously formulated the thought experiment, I think, therefore I am. He systematically doubted the existence of the physical world, his own body, and all external reality, arguing that his mind was the only thing he could be truly certain existed.
That is philosophical skepticism. It is an interesting academic exercise, but it is a position of permanent, paralyzing doubt. You cannot live your life as a philosophical skeptic.
And scientific skeptics do not do that. They also aren't just cynical contrarians who reflexively oppose the mainstream consensus because it feels edgy to be a rebel. Cynicism is just as intellectually lazy as blind gullibility.
Scientific skepticism is a practical, rigorous, corrective system for living in the real world. Yes, the skeptic starts from a position of doubt. They demand evidence.
But they do not end in doubt. They use the tools of logic, probability, and the scientific method to separate what we can provisionally know from what is merely fantasy, bias, or wishful thinking.
And the most beautiful part is that we know, demonstrably, that this grinding, methodical system works. As the book points out, we cannot know anything about the universe with 100% metaphysical certitude. Our brains are too flawed for that.
But through the scientific method, we can grind out knowledge that is reliable enough to act upon.
We can observe the stars, do the incredibly complex mathematics of orbital mechanics, build a machine out of metal and silicon, strap it to a controlled explosion, shoot it out of the atmosphere, send it hurtling through the vacuum of space for billions of miles, and drop it into orbit around Pluto to send gorgeous, high-resolution pictures back to our phones.
The sheer reality of that achievement proves that our incremental, skeptical scientific knowledge is reliably true.
It works, but despite its proven track record, people constantly push back against the skeptical approach. When skeptics challenge alternative medicine or astrology or psychic readings, the most common refrain from the public is, "What's the harm?"
Why do you care? If someone wants to believe that a crystal is healing their aura or that the alignment of Saturn is affecting their mood, why not just let them have their comforting beliefs? Why do you feel the need to pop their bubble and ruin the magic?
The source material addresses that question with brutal, necessary clarity. The answer to what's the harm is death by pseudoscience. Beliefs do not exist in a vacuum. They dictate actions.
When people are convinced by astroturfed campaigns or pseudoscientific marketing to substitute fake, untested, magical cures for real, evidence-based medicine, they suffer. Diseases progress, and sometimes, tragically, they die. The harm is tangible and real.
The authors of the book, who are medical professionals and active science communicators, talk about the heartbreaking emails they receive constantly. They hear from people pleading for help as they watch their spouses, their parents, or their children waste their limited time, drain their life savings, and abandon their actual lives to chase fantasy cures in clinics abroad, driven entirely by misinformation.
Pseudoscience is not a harmless quirk. It is an exploitative industry.
So how should you, the listener, act in the real world when you are armed with this understanding and this toolkit? It can feel overwhelming to realize how flawed the system is. The authors advise a three-pronged approach for navigating this. Be humble, be nurturing, and be courageous.
The first step, always, is neuropsychological humility. It means internalizing the fact that your own brain is just as flawed as the conspiracy theorist's brain. You are subject to the same heuristics, the same change blindness, the same motivated reasoning.
You must apply skepticism to your own deeply held beliefs first. Being nurturing means changing how you interact with others. When you encounter someone who holds a demonstrably false belief, you do not attack them. You don't call them stupid.
You understand that their belief is the product of human cognitive flaws interacting with a toxic information environment. You try to understand their narrative, and you patiently model how to think critically, rather than just telling them what to think.
And the final piece, being courageous, is perhaps the most difficult, but the most important. The text offers a highly relatable, everyday scenario. Imagine you are sitting in a doctor's or a pediatrician's office. You trust this person. They have medical degrees on the wall.
And suddenly, they recommend a treatment to you that you know is pure, unadulterated nonsense. Perhaps they suggest homeopathy, which is mathematically proven to be nothing more than expensive water.
In that moment, the social pressure is immense. The easiest, most comfortable thing to do is to simply nod politely, take the prescription, pay your copay, throw the paper in the trash, and quietly decide to find a new doctor later.
But the authors urge you to find your courage. They urge you to stand up for reason in that room. You don't have to be aggressive, but you must give that professional feedback.
You look them in the eye and say, politely but firmly, that you value science-based medicine, that you know homeopathy violates the basic laws of chemistry, and that you expect evidence-based care from your physician.
When you do that, you break the illusion of consensus. You drop a tiny pebble of critical thinking into the world, and the ripples move outward. You force the system to acknowledge the skepticism.
And ultimately, the authors completely reframe the concept of skepticism. It is often portrayed as a heavy, joyless burden, the exhausting task of constantly doubting the magic of the world. But that is entirely wrong.
Scientific skepticism is an incredibly liberating, deeply empowering tool. You do not have to labor under the crushing weight of oppressive, illogical belief systems.
You do not have to live in fear of imaginary curses, or worry about what your astrological forecast dictates for your week, or feel helpless in the face of medical charlatans.
You are completely intellectually free to believe only what actually makes sense and what can be supported by demonstrable evidence.
Let's bring all of these threads together. Over the course of this extensive deep dive, we have examined the architecture of belief. We've looked at the biological hardware that forces our brains to see agency, to find meaning in chaos, and to literally construct our visual reality from assumptions.
We've examined the software glitches, the heuristics, the unit biases, the confirmation bias that make us fiercely, desperately defend our existing worldview against all contradictory evidence.
And we've analyzed the institutional systems, the media, the academic pressures, the astroturfing campaigns that actively exploit those exact biological vulnerabilities for profit, for attention, and for ideological power.
As we wrap up this exploration, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought, building directly on the epilogue of our source material. The ultimate, perhaps paradoxical lesson of engaging deeply with scientific skepticism is that you must learn to trust no one.
You should not blindly trust the media, no matter how prestigious the masthead. You should not blindly trust the experts, because experts are human and subject to bias and ideomotor effects.
Yeah.
And perhaps most terrifyingly of all, you should never fully trust your own brain.
But rather than viewing this mandate to trust no one as a terrifying, isolating realization that leaves you adrift in a sea of endless doubt, consider the exact opposite perspective. It might be the key to ultimate intellectual freedom.
If you finally truly accept that your intuition is fundamentally flawed, you are no longer a prisoner. You are no longer susceptible to every emotional manipulation, every astroturfed corporate campaign, or every false pattern the world throws at you.
By letting go of the arrogant, comforting assumption that your perception is perfect, you are finally free to demand the evidence. You step out of the illusion, and you begin to engage with the reality of the universe on its own terms.
What a profound and vital place to end. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the systems that shape our beliefs on crisis and perception. We hope this journey through neuropsychological humility has given you some valuable perspective and some practical tools to navigate a world that is increasingly structurally full of fake.
It's been a great conversation.
Just a quick reminder, this project is completely free and publicly accessible. But if you value this kind of deep, systems-level analysis, and you want to support the immense amount of time, the tools, and the rigorous research that goes into producing Crisis and Perception, please consider becoming a supporter on our Patreon.
And if you want to review the complex concepts we covered today, like the spinning girl illusion or the mechanics of p-hacking, be sure to check out the visual mini-explainer we have linked down in the description.
And finally, we want to hear from you. Please like, subscribe, and jump into the comments to let us know what books, what hidden structures, or what complex systems you'd like us to deconstruct and analyze next. Until then, stay humble, stay courageous, and keep asking the hard questions.